Okay, so hello. I would say first thanks for watching. It's quite a different environment to how I expected to be giving this presentation. Um, Obviously, this virus has caused a lot of disruption, but nevertheless, I guess this is a transferable skill, right? To be able to record yourself on a presentation on a PowerPoint slide and give it online, right? I hope. Um, Nevertheless, I will try and do my best to present on Christian pacifism, as this title slide shows. The reason I chose this was even going back to week 2 when we were talking about the Beatitudes, about Matthew 5:9, blessed are the peacemakers. Um, it was something that got me thinking about whether we can use the New Testament to justify non-violence, or whether it's more based on just war or potentially violent actions at times. And it was just something that I've been reflecting on personally. So when I saw that war and peace was a topic that we'd be ending this semester on, I thought I may as well go and try and give this as my presentation topic. So the seminar question I'll be discussing itself is: the New Testament has been used to justify pacifism, just war, and crusading. Does any of these stances have more of a textual justification than the other? And in doing so, I've chosen to speak about two theologians, primarily because they both have a dialogue with each other. The first being Richard Hayes, who gives a pacifist reading of the New Testament, who was then critiqued by Nigel Biggar in his work In Defense of War in 2013. So as I was saying, these two names, these two theologians, both contemporary theologians who have a dialogue with each other. Hayes a pacifist, Biggar a just war theorist. And I will present by first giving an outline of Richard Hayes's pacifist reading the New Testament. I will then talk about Nigel Biggar's critique of Hayes, briefly end on Hayes's response to Biggar's critiques, and in lieu of not having a discussion, I will then give some summary opinions of my own, how I think this leaves us, what I think this means for Christian actions in general. So to start off, Richard Hayes, born 1948, he's still alive, formerly professor at Duke Divinity School. He retired in 2018 nonetheless. He's actually ordained a Methodist minister, and the work he published, A Moral Vision of the New Testament in 1997, where he attempts to give an interpretation of the ethical teachings in the New Testament. He dedicates the final portion, or the final third of his book, to his ethics in practice, and we'll focus on chapter 14, where he talks about peace and war, although he does have another couple of other influential chapters. Chapter 16 on homosexuality is quite influential, so if you're interested in that, do give it a read. But what I'll discuss first is his hermeneutics and his exegesis. So he analyzes the New Testament and tries to find images and themes which appear throughout that highlight ethical concerns and acts. This is what he refers to as his hermeneutical task, first and foremost. And he thinks that through these three focal images, he calls them, it veers us towards advocating pacifism from reading the New Testament. So the first he advocates is community. This is where the church is called to be a community that embodies reconciliation, to refer to 2 Corinthians 5:18 to 20. Secondly, we should read it through the lens of the cross. The New Testament is the story of a Messiah who refuses the defense of the sword and dies at the hands of a pagan state that bears the power of the sword. One ought to view the overall narrative of Jesus' life as the embodiment of human wholeness, and the narrative of the passion and his death as a disclosure of the costly faithfulness and enemy love that leads to reconciliation in Romans 5:10. The final lens he uses is the promise of a new creation. He argues that the church can live in accordance with the way of the cross as it looks towards a new creation, the resurrection of the dead and the healing of all that's broken. So this is an eschatological idea with a new creation, a new generation in mind, which he says frees us from the need to grasp security through violence and actually enables us to bear witness to a peaceful hope of a new age to come. So he says through these lens we should read the New Testament and undertake our exegesis. And after comes what he calls a pragmatic task, or trying to understand what the New Testament readings mean for Christians in practice. He thinks this obviously means the practice of non-violence. So much of Hayes' argument is drawn from Matthew's Gospel, Acts and Romans, and he does this in order to show that this isn't based upon one Gospel solely, but upon a coherent voice throughout the New Testament. So I'll explain three passages first that we've spoken about before from the Sermon on the Mount, which he believes show that Jesus is characterized as a non-violent person. First, Matthew 5:21-26 speaks about how anger ought to be overcome through reconciliation with one another and not through conflict. As it says, first be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come to offer your gift. Secondly, Matthew 5:38-42. This second passage argues against retaliation. Obviously, it involves the famous saying, but if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. This argues against acting instinctively upon anger, using violence. And lastly, following immediately after that, Matthew 43-48 touches on the notion of loving your enemy. As I've highlighted there, you shall love your neighbour and hate your enemy, but I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. So this touches upon having a love for one another and striving in this final verse as well for that idea of perfection, that Stoic idea of perfection that we've previously spoken about. Overall, Hayes' findings, he says that the New Testament itself isn't prescriptive in giving a list of rules, but a character and ideology which Christians ought to follow. When read through the lenses that are spoke about of community, cross and new creation, we're pushed towards a non-violent ideology. First, where anger is overcome through reconciliation, retaliation is renounced, and love for your enemy replaces hate. Then comes the pragmatic task, which he says we ought to base upon Jesus. To quote him, he says, we find our identity and our moral vocation as people of God within the story of Jesus Christ and nowhere else. He thinks that when one looks at the text and at Jesus, just war theorists like Nigel Biggar, who I'll speak about in a moment, struggle to argue their case without having to rely upon secondary writing, secondary sources, and other theologians like Augustine and Aquinas. Rather, we ought to base our Christian ethics upon the virtuous life, role model of Jesus, and nowhere else. So that leads me on to Nigel Biggar. As I was saying, a just war theorist. Born in 1955, still alive, actually born in Galloway. Professor at Christ Church, Oxford. If you Google his name, it comes up with a lot about a scandal that he was involved in where he tried to sort of justify the role of the British Empire. We won't talk about that. We'll talk about his work in Defence of War, which was published in 2013. One moment. Where he argues for just war. To quote him, he says, my opposition to pacifism is not a priori, but rather it's based on historical experience. He describes his book and the purpose of his book as defending the doctrine of just war from a position of anthropological and moral realism, arguing against a virtual pacifism that depends on an optimistic anthropology. So, Biggar's critique, he outlines his arguments against Hayes, firstly in chapter 1 of his book In Defence of War, but he actually argues against 3 pacifist theologians. But he admits that Hayes is actually the strongest and what he thinks is the most scripturally based reading of Christian pacifism that he knows of. There are 4 critiques that I'll go over in these slides, but I'm also mindful of time, so they will be quite fleeting and brief. However, if you're interested, obviously go and read the source. The 4 issues that I'll speak about is firstly the role of soldiers in the New Testament. Secondly, Jesus' repudiation of religious nationalist revolt. Third, conceptual distinctions between anger, resentment, and loving and hateful retaliation. And finally, I'll end on talking about Paul's doctrine of atonement. So to move firstly to what he thinks is an issue for a pacifist reading of the New Testament, the role of soldiers. So Hayes argues that when Jesus engages with soldiers, it shows that the word of God is so powerful that it can reach even the most unlikeliest of people. For example, if we look at the centurion at Capernaum, Matthew 8 or Luke 7, 1-10, Jesus engages with these people who we may have thought would be sinners if we were looking at this from a pacifist reading. Is Jesus engaging with these soldiers perhaps possibly legitimizing violence in some way? Well, Biggar's critique is threefold in this. He says, well, the gospel itself isn't actually explicit about what these soldiers' sin is, whereas if we look at tax collectors, we're told that their sin is greed. With soldiers, Jesus doesn't identify an explicit sin that they have. Secondly, soldiers being Gentiles is more dramatic than their profession as military personnel. So engaging with them isn't necessarily legitimizing violence, and that isn't the dramatic part of it. Rather, it's their role as Gentiles and the fact that Jesus and John engage with them against Jewish law. Lastly, nowhere is it mentioned that one has to renounce their military profession in order to attain salvation. Surely, as he puts it, if being a soldier is sinful, then the authors would want to say so. Secondly, religious nationalist revolt. Hayes argues that there's instances in which Jesus denies violence or retaliation in self-defense, even in justice of a third party. So he refers to the temptation narrative in Matthew 4 and Jesus in Gethsemane in Matthew 26, which involves the verse, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword shall perish by the sword." Biggar argues that the only scriptural justification that we have for Jesus denying violence is that if it's personal, so it isn't publicly authorized, like in Romans 13, which is used to justify violence, and is inspired by conviction that Israel is the divinely chosen nation, and there's a corresponding hatred to Gentile imperial masters. He thinks that Hayes pushes this too far, and the violence that Jesus refutes cannot extend to all violence, but only these specific instances. Which lead me on to the next critique he has, which is that Hayes ought to make more conceptual distinctions. So he agrees that there are certain kinds of violence that the New Testament forbids: anger, hatred, retaliation, etc. But one of the papers that Biggar writes to Hayes is called "Specify and Distinguish" with a big exclamation mark at the end. What Biggar says that the preaching of Jesus gives against anger and hatred in the passages that we looked at earlier from Matthew is in fact in reference to an anger that's instinctive and vengeful. He talks about deontological ethics, the intention behind the violence and act. Perhaps there's a certain type of righteous anger, in fact, that we can get, or a proportionate anger, to touch upon this just war theory element of proportionality, the rule of proportionality found in Jus ad bellum. Hayes doesn't distinguish enough. He's generalizing too much and distinguishes too little. Perhaps Jesus is forbidding certain types of anger, but not this righteous anger, as we've seen where Jesus overturns the money changers' tables in the temple. Finally, the critique that he gives is Paul's doctrine of the atonement. Hayes says that Paul infers from Jesus' death that God deals with enemies not by killing them, but through responding in peace and seeking peace through a self-emptying service or self-giving love. Biggar agrees that what this passage shows in Romans is that Christians ought to respond to their enemies with love and compassion first and foremost. But again, we can't say that this prohibits lethal force in all cases. So what he's saying is that Paul doesn't say that sinners anywhere escape God's wrath. Perhaps in extremis, there are some cases where he calls incorrigible sinners. God may actually use lethal force upon judgment of them. And this may institute, it may say that there are instances in which Christians may be permitted to use lethal force themselves, if in extremis there are sinners which may warrant it. So they're the four critiques that Biggar gives that I think are the most damaging potentially to Hayes' argument. However, how does Richard Hayes respond? He responds in a couple of papers back and forth, as I was saying. firstly, on the soldiers' point, he says that in Capernaum, linking the Gentiles' faith to the recognition of Jesus, the authority of Jesus as God, is dramatic itself, yes, but it isn't the case that sinners themselves are meant to be characterized explicitly like that, or renounce their practice in the text. Biggar's argument itself is one from silence, but we can flip that on its head and say that there's actually nowhere in the New Testament where soldiers are actually commended for violent acts or for their profession. So it becomes somewhat of a moot point. On religious nationalism, actually when arguing this, Biggar says that it's a controversial point to put, and he doesn't actually offer any scriptural justification for this claim itself. On the conceptual distinctions between anger, Hayes is quite, let's say, strong in his wording when he writes to Biggar here, because he says that Biggar refers to Ephesians and Matthew as a claim that there's a difference between certain types of anger in the Bible. However, he says he's cherry-picking these texts and not actually looking in the context that they're used. He's saying that there's an element of fraternal anger, a sort of, what could one say, a certain type of personal anger, a brotherly anger, but this distinction doesn't allow violence in some cases. He's actually just cherry-picking half of the verses in some cases. And lastly, on the atonement, Paul's quite clear. He says, "Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave room for the wrath of God. It is up to God, not the Christian believer themselves, to undertake this judgment." We shouldn't, as Christians, use violence in lieu of the fact that God's judgment is not coming upon our enemies. So where does that leave us? Obviously, I've used up quite a lot of time, but I'll just end because I'm aware that we don't have any discussion, obviously, through this method, on some of my opinions and some of my thoughts that have come out of doing this research. To go back to the seminar question that I'm answering specifically, which stance is more textual justification? I don't see anywhere in which it says that Jesus will look towards violence as being the best answer or something that a Christian ought to do. There's an emphasis, especially as Hayes puts in Matthew, for loving your enemy and having a self-giving love. And when Biggar tries to justify himself from the text, he gets criticised quite strongly from Hayes in his counter-argument. Further, just war theorists often have to rely on other sources, and theologians, as I was saying, like Aquinas and Augustine, and Biggar admits this in the introduction of his book. To call itself a Christian just war theorist, you have to rely on theologians elsewhere as opposed to the gospel. Romans 13 is a passage, I think, which causes some issue for pacifists. Hayes reads with an Anabaptist line, as Biggar says, that even if the governing power has a God-given authority to punish the wicked, it's not for the role of believers to actually partake in this. Whether or not this actually means that the Christians ought to take up the sword or not, you could say that perhaps what the Bible calls for is a Christian to actually bear witness to an alternate society completely governed by God, where there is no need for the sword in the first instance. However, that is potentially drawing upon this sort of like optimistic element that Biggar refers to previously in the introduction of his book. Christology, briefly we've talked about this before, whether having a high or low Christology, what that means for Christian ethics in general. I think either way that we read Jesus and the role of Jesus in the Gospels, there's a push towards peace in either way. Jesus is portrayed as being virtuous, and in Matthew, a virtuous human being. Although God is the one who ultimately judges, it's not the role of the Christian or the Christian person to do. To be loving, to turn the other cheek is, to reconcile in ways of peace. The impact, therefore, on Christian action, what does it mean for Christians? Well, speaking about political ethics last week, what would Jesus do? Going back to Hayes' initial argument and the pragmatic task that he puts forward in the last part of his book, A Moral Vision, that comes out of his exegesis, I'd say to try and avoid violence, to try and reconcile is what Christians should aim to do. However, I think where it gets a bit sticky for pacifist reading, especially given that to argue for pacifism is quite a strong conclusion to draw. Is where it comes in, is where not acting in violence, not getting involved in war and conflict potentially leads to a greater harm than not doing, than actually in being involved in violence. So this is where I think the doctrine of double effect may come into play. Maybe being involved in violence is the lesser of two evils. This is something that Biggar touches upon later on in his book, which I'm currently reading and giving a critique on. But I think that's where I'm stuck, in my opinion. Perhaps a pacifist stance may actually incur more harm than a non-pacifist stance, but however, I do feel like there is more scriptural and textual justification for pacifist reading of the New Testament as opposed to not. So lastly, under my bibliography, you may note that it says that there's papers going back and forth between 2009 and 2010 prior to In Defense of War. This is because he's read Biggar's paper prior that was published in Defense of War. So don't get too confused about the dates there. Hopefully this has been okay in lieu of not being able to present to class and having a discussion. But hopefully this has been enlightening, a bit of an introduction into Christian pacifism and touching on the critiques. Thank you for listening. Hopefully this is recorded properly, or otherwise I'm going to have another 20 minutes of speaking into a camera, which I would not look forward to. But thank you very much. Any questions, feel free to email me. And thank you for a great class, folks. See you later.